refresh the page. Huh?
So we're live streaming, unbelievably. So we'll start at 5 past. Please just speak amongst yourselves. We think it's working.
Audio check, audio check. What if we stand here? And I guess, oh no, it's fine. There we go. So, well, it should work, but it depends on the delay. The wait.
Okay. Thank you very much, everyone, for joining us. Today is the last day, the scheduled last day of COP26. So we as a department, we thought that we would try and mark this momentous historic kind of meeting with our own small contribution to the ongoing debate about how our global community is going to cope with the challenges of the 21st century, dominated by climate change, but also sustainable development is a very, very important aspect of this process. And at the heart of some of the discussions of COP26 is this idea of sustainable development. And the UN has an agenda for sustainable development, which aligns very closely with some of the things that we as a department try to do, both in archaeology, heritage, and related approaches. So I'm just going to read you very quickly the statement from the UN around sustainable development. So the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, adopted by all United Nations members states in 2015, provides a shared blueprint for peace and prosperity for the people and the planet now and into the future. Something that we all, I think, hopefully could join in with. At the heart of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, and you can hear a lot about them through the next 2 hours, which are an urgent call for action for all countries, developed and developing, in a global partnership. They recognise that ending poverty and other deprivations must go hand in hand with strategies that improve health and education, reduce inequality and spur economic growth, all while tackling climate change and working to preserve our oceans and forests. So, very exciting agenda, there's a deadline, there's some goals. But what role does archaeology play in that agenda? Well, hopefully, today's programme of speakers and the panel discussion at the end will demonstrate and showcase some of the approaches that we're taking in the Department of Archaeology. So, without further ado, I'd like to invite our first speaker, Dr Karen Milek, who will be talking against and aligning against one of the Sustainable Development Goals, which is climate action. So, over to you, Karen.
Thank you very much, Mike. And thanks to all of you here and at home for coming to hear this talk. Rain on snow. To those of us living in temperate regions, it doesn't sound so bad, right? The rain falls on top of snow, it melts some of the snow. And if temperatures get a bit colder, again, the rain may refreeze, and it causes a minor inconvenience. But in the high Arctic, where these guys live, and it's absolutely deadly. In November 2013, a rain on snow event covered 10,000 square miles on the Yamal Peninsula in western Siberia with a blanket of ice. Now, these ice layers make it impossible for reindeer and other herbivores to dig through the snow for the lichen and other herbs that provide them with food through the winter. 61,000 reindeer died of starvation that year in 2013. And they weren't wild reindeer. Those don't exist on the Yamal Peninsula anymore. These were domesticated reindeer, owned by indigenous Nenettes, who, together with their predecessors in this region, have been herding reindeer for perhaps as long as 2,000 years. They cull the reindeer for meat, for their own consumption, and also for the commercial market, which provide them with the additional cash that they need to buy other necessary items. The reindeer need to eat on the move, and so the Nenettes move with them, using teams of deer to pull sleds both in summer and the winter, covering distances of sometimes up to 1,200 kilometers a year. Now, 22% of their herds were lost in 2013, and the most unlucky families, the ones who just couldn't make it past the icy conditions in time to feed their reindeer, they lost everything. And it will take years, generations of borrowed stock to build up those breeding populations again, those herds, to what they once were. And this wasn't an isolated event, because a similar catastrophe had happened just a few years earlier in 2006. And it is also a very widespread problem. It's being monitored by numerous Arctic research organizations, and with the help of an extensive network of local observers, the Arctic Rain on Snow study has produced this map, which shows the main rain on snow events that have taken place in recent years between 2013 and the present. Now, all the wild and domestic animals that rely on being able to paw through the snow to get food resources below it suffer when temperatures fluctuate and the rain falls and then freezes again. But it's the muskox and the reindeer tarandus, that's caribou and reindeer, that have taken the most noticeable hit. In fact, freezing rain is one of the factors that's been fingered as being responsible for the 56% decline in global reindeer tarandus populations in the last 2 decades. And that comes from the US Arctic Program's Arctic Report Card in 2018. And what's the cause of this, these rain on snow events? Well, you won't be surprised to hear that it's global warming. Because global warming causes a wetter, warmer and wetter Arctic winter. And in the case of the event in 2013, it was triggered by the Barents and Kara sea ice thinning and retreating in early November, when normally it's expanding at that time. That meant that there was a larger area of these seas that was available for, was able to evaporate and cause moisture conditions in the atmosphere, and that in turn caused increased rainfall. And these maps come from a publication by a colleague of mine, Bruce Forbes, who's based at the University of Lapland in Finland. And he's been studying these rain on snow events on the Yamal Peninsula, and what you can see here is some modeling that he did looking at the expansion of exposed water at this time, and unusually high precipitation levels, which converged on the Yamal Peninsula in early November that year. And of course there are other impacts of Arctic warming as well, and one of them is the greening of the tundra, so-called shrubification. I think it's fun to take away a new word in our vocabulary once in a while, and shrubification was a new one for me. I wonder if it is for you as well. What it refers to is the expansion of shrubs during those warmer summer months, particularly in June. So work on concentric growth rings on Arctic shrubs has shown that really rapid shrub growth is primarily due to warm June temperatures. More than any other month, it's June that's most important. And what you can see, and these pictures are from the Yukon in Canada, they're just images that I had available to me, but you can see that over the course of a few decades, you have the conversion of an Arctic flora that's dominated by lichens and low-lying herbs to a shrub-dominated and wetter environment as well. So this actually places additional pressure on herbivores, because the food sources for rangifer herds is predominantly lichen and other tundra flora, not the shrubs. And so it's actually affecting the food available to them and lowering the birth rates. But of course, reindeer and reindeer herders have been living in this area for a really long time. So it's good to look at what kinds of effects past climate change may have had on them, because they have been around, we think now, for around 2,000 years, interacting really closely together. And the evidence for that comes from a recent paper by Rob Losey, who is a zooarchaeologist, but he's been looking very recently at a whole series of artifacts that were found in Western Siberia that look like this. So these are L-shaped or slightly curved antler objects that very closely resemble harness pieces that are used for reindeer that are used to pull sleds. But there's something unusual about them. They have these barbs on them. And he had a project that worked closely with indigenous Nenets people to identify what these headgear parts might be. And the result of that study, which included the laser scanning of these objects and 3D printing them to allow them to be used by the Nenets, the result of that study was that they think that they were used actually to train younger reindeer to pull sleds. You wouldn't have those sharp barbs worn in the longer term. It's just too uncomfortable, and it would cause pain to the reindeer that is not necessary. But in the training stage, they think these might have been used. They're not used like that today, but that was based on ethnographic work. The oldest of these objects comes from the site of Ust-Pului, which is now in present-day Salakhard at the lower end of the Yamal Peninsula. They date to around 2,000 years ago. So if we think about reindeer herding in this region going back 2,000 years, let's have a look at the local climate in the area. This is the best climate model that we have for the nearby region. This was based on dendroclimatological work by Briffa et al. It was published in 2013, and it uses tree ring growth rings to infer temperature change. Based on the width of the tree ring, you can infer whether there's been a warmer or a cooler summer. And what you can see is that there is a lot of fluctuation over the last 2,000 years. Over the last 2 decades, there's been this hike that we are aware of today. And going back over 2,000 years, you can see that there's really only one period that was as warm as it was today, and that's about a 40-year period on either side of the year 250 AD. And so it looks like most of this time, although there's been fluctuations, the temperatures have been nice and cold, which is the way reindeer like it. So if we have a look at that span of time and those fluctuations in temperature, can we have a look at the archaeology of the region and try to understand from this long-term perspective how resilient reindeer herders in the region have been. So I was very fortunate to join a larger research group led by Bruce Forbes at the University of Lapland, who got a JPI climate grant to collaborate with colleagues in the University of Aberdeen, that was David Anderson, as well as in Russia, Andrei Plekhanov at the Arctic Research Center, colleagues in Fennoscandia, including Nenets and Sami researchers as well. And I joined the group at the University of Aberdeen, where I was at the time, and worked with them on a particular archaeological site in the tundra called Yarta 6. So this is right in the middle of the Yamal Peninsula, right here, and in the middle of those migration pathways of the Nenets reindeer herders today. Yarta 6 is one of multiple sites that are all on a plateau on the edge of the Urabi River floodplain. And you can see how complex that floodplain is today. It freezes over the winter, and in ideal conditions, the reindeer will be able to cross it in the spring on ice. But when the ice breaks up too early, as it's doing more and more commonly now, they have to swim across, and you can see how dangerous that may be. But let's have a look at Yarta 6 and see what information we were able to get from that site. It's a really special site in the landscape. You can see that the vegetation stands out, and it was found by archaeological surveyors already in the 1990s, and has been excavated for multiple field seasons since 1993. Over 22,000 Rangifer bones have been found on this excavation, and these have been studied now by Rob Losey in a lot of detail. The date of the site itself comes from both radiocarbon evidence, but also, interestingly, dendrochronology from well-preserved willow stakes from the early excavations when the site was still within permafrost and the wood was preserved. It's not preserved in permafrost anymore. The permafrost has now lowered, and when we encounter wood on the site in 2013, 2015, it was actually all decomposed already. But the willow stakes preserved from the earlier excavations showed that the site was occupied between around 1066 and 1105. In 2015, I went out there with a team to do some soil survey in the surrounding area in order to see if we could better understand the reindeer herding component of the site. And so what we did to do that is did a soil survey on the plateau adjacent to the site itself and looked for evidence of congregated reindeer that were clustered together in a way, and standing still for a while, in a way that wild herds would not do. So this involved different kinds of survey methods, magnetic susceptibility methods. Here we're excavating small soil test pits, describing the soils. And this is Loïc Arrault, PDRA, who was running a field lab to start to process those samples in the field. What we found is that there were a whole series of buried soils which we were luckily able to date using radiocarbon of small fragments of charcoal, willow and birch charcoal that was found within these buried soils. And the best dates that we were able to get come from these two test pits. Unfortunately, not all the test pits provided us with good dates. But what you can see is that the time frame for occupation, having small campsites on this plateau, predates that main site that was the focus of excavation since the 1990s. In fact, occupation of this plateau dates back to the 5th century AD. And the final results of all of the soils analyses that we did are presented here. So what you can see is that we have changes over time, and here I'm showing you a sequence of a series of soil horizons that first date from probably around 460 to 550 AD. That is the lowermost one. Here we found just a couple of, a bit of evidence for reindeer excrement. Now this comes from a new technique that we've been applying called lipid biomarker analysis, which Louis Garot has been working very hard to improve so that we can have evidence for the species-specific feces that were deposited in that soil. The evidence starts very modestly with a little bit of reindeer presence, but it grows over subsequent centuries. So that, and here is looking very clustered indeed. So this is approaching 800, 900 AD, and a dog excrement is also evident here. And finally, in around the period that would be, say, contemporary with the occupation of the main site, we have a slightly larger reindeer herd again, clustered close to that larger site. So what we're seeing here is evidence for where reindeer were congregated and herded together. What we can see also in terms of the climate curve for this time is that there are periods of warmer and colder temperatures that we can think about how they're related to the occupation of the site. The first thing I should note, though, is that really cold temperatures that we would associate with, for example, Little Ice Age in the 19th century are associated with an explosion in domesticated reindeer numbers in this area. This is where reindeer herding actually goes in industrial scale, and you start to get herds of many hundreds or even thousands of reindeer. Prior to that, the evidence seems to show that they were quite small and contained herds. In fact, it looks like at the beginning they came with just 1 or 2 tame or domesticated reindeer to help them hunt the wild deer. So using them as a decoy, for example, this is, it looks like just a couple of domesticated reindeer were there at the beginning, and then larger herds that were able to transport individuals there on sleds, and finally clusters of reindeer herds that were necessary for that transport to bring all those people into this area, which really can't be accessed by foot. You need those reindeer sleds to do that. So it looks like that we can see the growth of a small-scale rancher for following community hunting wild deer with the help of trained animals, both reindeer and dogs. So what's the future of reindeer herders in this area? Now that they have such massive herds, are they going to be able to be resilient in the face of climate change? Well, projecting forward, we can see that there is going to be a much bigger ratio of precipitation as rainfall rather than snow. So in the present day, about 65% of Arctic precipitation falls as snow, but projecting into the future, it's going to be about 60% of Arctic precipitation that will fall as rain if we follow current climate trajectories. So what is the reindeer for the future for reindeer herders coping with this rainy Arctic? We're going to see continued reindeer mortality, the warming of the region, the sea ice decline, increase in precipitation, those winter temperatures, and that increase in rain on snow events, and the spread of the shrubs, all means it's going to be harder for the reindeer and the people who live with them to survive in this region. So everything is in the hands, I think, of those individuals at COP26 who are going to try to limit the expansion of climate change and the warming of the Arctic. But the reindeer herders themselves are resilient. They've been through temperature fluctuations before, and they know what they need to do to be resilient going forward. They're going to need a lot of flexibility in the ranges that they have for their reindeer, and no barriers to rapid movement. And there are barriers at the moment, including pipelines and railways. And they're going to need really good climate predictions, really good weather predictions, early warning systems, and really good communication in order to maintain the lifestyle in this continually warming environment. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Karen. I think we've got enough time just for a very quick question. Any questions from the audience? No? Well, in that case, we can bring up some of the themes in the panel discussion next. Thank you very much indeed, Karen. So, next up, we have Dr Kristen Hopper, who is going to be talking around the Sustainable Development Goal number 16, Peace, Justice and Strong Institutions. So over to you, Kristen.
Thank you. Right. So thank you very much. So as Mike indicated, today I'm going to talk about a project that we've participated in with several other organizations to document Yazidi cultural heritage in Iraq. But first off, just tell you a bit about who we are and what we do. I work as part of the Endangered Archaeology in the Middle East and North Africa project, or the AMINA project, which is a collaboration between the universities of Oxford, Leicester, and Durham. And what we do is we use satellite imagery to rapidly record and monitor archaeological sites across the Middle East and North Africa region, or the MENA region. We also work with relevant local authorities on the ground to share knowledge, which will help limit likely damage and better plan and implement for the preservation and protection of heritage. And in specific cases, our work intersects with this sustainable development goal, particularly this peace, justice, and strong institutions, in that the work that we do focuses on collecting evidence of the destruction of cultural heritage in conflict to provide evidence for legal proceedings and to support effective communities in pursuing justice. So one of these cases was the production of a report that we did in collaboration with Yazda, which is a community-led organization focused on advocacy and projects working to protect minority groups in Iraq, the Kurdistan region in Syria, and with Rashid, which is a worldwide network of archaeologists and cultural heritage specialists that are dedicated to safeguarding cultural heritage of Iraq. And the report we did, it outlines the destruction of Yazidi cultural heritage by Islamic State that occurred during the genocide against the Yazidis. So our contribution as the AMINA project was to analyze satellite imagery to provide evidence for the destruction of tangible cultural heritage. So to start off, to just give you a bit of background as to who the Yazidi community are. So they are an endogamous community, meaning they practice the marrying within specific ethno-religious group from northern Iraq. The Yazidi, they trace their heritage and origins and faith back thousands of years in the region. And so the key features of the Yazidi faith, characterized by belief in God and Taghut Malik, the highest angel. And the holiest place for the Yazidi people is Lalish, which you can see a picture of here. And what's just interesting to note is the architecture of Yazidi shrines and are very specific in terms of these conical roofs associated with their religious sites. So because of their religious beliefs, the Yazidi community became the target of Islamic State. So specifically, what occurred was beginning in August 2014, Islamic State launched a series of attacks against the Yazidi community in northern Iraq. Many Yazidis fled. I'm sure many of you all remember the really horrifying news coverage of the Yazidi people that had to flee up to Mount Sinjar, besieged by Islamic State, many succumbing to heat, dehydration, starvation. And the horrific acts committed against the Yazidi people by Islamic State included sexual slavery of women, forced conversion, militarization of children, and many thousands of Yazidis were killed. But Islamic State also set out to destroy both the tangible and intangible cultural heritage of the Yazidi people. And our work with Yazda and Rashid set out to document this cultural heritage destruction. So how do we do this? How do we use satellite imagery to look at the destruction of cultural heritage? So we use various kinds of high-resolution satellite imagery to identify sites, and we use imagery from different dates to assess what damages have occurred, the extent of them, the cause of them, the effect of those damages, and of course, as best we can, when that occurred. So this is just giving you an example here, an example that you've probably heard of before, of the destruction of Palmyra in Syria. So quite a well-known example where some of the structures at Palmyra were destroyed during conflict. So you can see here quite clearly that we have structures visible on this image here from February of 2014 that have been completely destroyed by the time this image was taken in April of 2016. So that gives you a sense of kind of how we go about doing this. The images that we had initially used for the Yazidi Cultural Heritage Documentation Project were commercial images that we had to purchase, and unfortunately I'm not able to share those specific images with you. However, recently Google Earth, which is a freely available imagery platform, has published some new images which actually do show these sites prior to and after destruction. And I'm going to share some examples with you now to illustrate this. So this, for example, is the site of Sheikh Abdul Qadir in Sinjar. And the shrine of Sheikh Abdul Qadir, you can see it here, particularly right here because of the shadow that is being cast here by the shrine. And we can see quite clearly in this image here that is taken a few months later that is completely gone. Well, the shrine was reported to us as probably having been destroyed in October of 2014. We can clearly see that from these images, it was completely demolished by early October of that year. And actually, in our analysis, we were able to establish that it was destroyed by at least the 31st of August, 2014. Another example here, this is from the site of Sheikh Hassan, also in Sinjar. Again, this one was reported to have been destroyed on the 12th of July in 2015. And in this case, we can clearly see the shrine here. And what's interesting is I told you that it was very notable the type of architecture that's used in these Yazidi shrines, are those pointed conical roofs. And we can very clearly here see the shadow that's cast by that pointed conical roof on this image. And so we can see here that it was this image taken on October 2014. The shrine is still visible, whereas by August 2016, we have no evidence for the shrine in that area. So suggesting that the reported destruction date fits very well within this window. Going a bit more in depth, this is staying at Sheikh Hassan in Sinjar, is that we can actually further verify this information using drone photos and on-the-ground photos that have been taken by our colleagues at Yazda, particularly Farish Mishka, who kindly allowed us to use these images, which we can then match what we're seeing on the satellite images here, almost exact details, to the same photographs that are being, the same areas that are being photographed via drone images. And then to just give you a sense of the destruction as it looked on the ground. So the last example that I just wanted to show you is this is Sheikh Mand in Sinjar. They're reported to have been destroyed on the 24th of August, 2014. And again, we can see our shrine here in this image in August, early August of that year, and again, completely destroyed by October 2014. And again, just giving you an example of what that looks like on the ground. And what's surprising is in these images, we can actually see some of those exact features. Here is this structure here, and we can actually see the shadow of what potentially is the down to top of the conical roof that's on top of that shrine. So what were the actual results of our report, of the work that we did? Well, we were able to identify 21 sites that had been, we could locate them and we could assess them with confidence on the imagery. However, there were many, many more sites that were also impacted by this across northern Iraq. So hopefully we might be able to do some more work on those in the future. Overall, for the report, we took this evidence that we'd collected and working with the legal officer from Rashid and Yazda, we were able to show that this evidence is destruction of tangible cultural heritage by Islamic State, and that this was done in conjunction with a coordinated policy of murder, slavery, sexual exploitation, and brainwashing of children to destroy Yazidi intangible cultural heritage. And ultimately, that the destruction of this cultural heritage in Iraq was a war crime, a crime against humanity, and is evidence of genocidal intent. So based on this evidence, Yazda and Rashid have been able to issue recommendations to International Criminal Court, national prosecutors, organizations like UNITAD, which is the investigative team to promote accountability for crimes committed by Daesh ISIL, and other organizations to pursue justice for the Yazidi community and to protect Yazidi cultural heritage into the future. So for further information, if you're interested in the work and for continued work that's being done on continued advocacy, I would encourage you to follow organizations like Yazda and Rashid. There's also an amazing virtual reality exhibition that's being put together called Nobody's Listening, which is actually documenting the stories of the survivors of the genocide. And as well as visiting our AMIA website, where we've got a new exhibition about it as well. And just to encourage you to watch our social media feeds next week, where we'll have another announcement about some recently published article on the same project. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Kristen, for that excellent but sobering talk. Has anybody got any questions? Yes.
We have some very clear documentation about the heritage aspects, right?
Sorry, could you say that again?
You have very clear documentation about the pristine situation of these.
Yes, yeah. So Yazda had documentation for the sites prior to their destruction as well, which we were able to review, as well as we can obviously verify that the sites existed prior to those dates using satellite imagery as well.
Yeah.
Okay, anybody else? Okay, thank you very much, Kristen. So next I'd like to invite Dr. Dan Lawrence, who will be talking and aligning himself to the SDG 11, which is Sustainable Cities and Communities. So over to you, Dan.
Thanks. Oh, quite an intense thing to follow. Brill, yes, thanks. So I'm talking about sustainable cities, and I'm kind of talking about a research idea we've been sort of noodling around with in my project. So it's a bit different to what the others have been talking about. So first question, so number 11 is the Sustainable Cities and Communities goal. And it's interesting that they've focused on cities and communities, cities first. Why cities is actually quite a good question. So I think if you talk about sustainable cities in the future, especially, you're legally obliged to say that in 2007, humanity crossed over to having 50% of people living in cities, probably for the first time ever globally. And that's due to go up to, I think it's by 2030, it's about 70% is the projection. So cities are a big, big part of our future and our present as well, obviously. Why is that interesting? Well, and why is that important for sustainability especially? Well, urban sites generally have high populations in a small space, which gives you high density, right? And that's really positive, actually, for lots of the things that we want to do in terms of reducing fossil fuel use. So it gives you kind of efficiencies of transport and infrastructure and social interactions. There's quite a lot of work being done on kind of settlement scaling as well, showing that bigger cities are more efficient even than smaller cities, which is quite interesting. But it also gives you some negatives too, right? So if you have lots of people in one place, then that generally causes particular kinds of ecological stress on the local environment. Think of, lots of cities in the global south that have big problems with water management, that sort of stuff. You get provisioning requirements, you get waste management, lots and lots of pollution in a small area. So there's positives and negatives to urbanisation. And ancient cities faced very similar problems across the board, right? Those problems are caused by density, and ancient cities are also generally pretty dense. We can have a low-density urbanism debate, but we'll do that maybe some other time. So why is that interesting in our area? So we're working in Mesopotamia, in ancient Southwest Asia, where we have this really long history of urban sites, about 6,500 years of urbanism, depending on how you define it. It's a really diverse environment, a lot of which is semi-arid, so quite dry, which means that it's vulnerable to different kinds of climate change as well. Just to explain, on your right-hand side, you can see the top one is just the countries, the one on the right-hand side is the digital elevation model, so heights. So you can see that big green flat area is southern Mesopotamia. That's rainfall, and you can see that kind of crescent of the fertile crescent. And then that's how we kind of term it in the literature, so northern Mesopotamia, southern Mesopotamia, and the Levant. During that 6,500 years, we have some rapid climate change events, so really quick climate changes, relatively quick, and we have a long-term drying trend across the kind of second half of the Holocene. So what you've got here is a series of what Jackson et al. Call completed experiments. We've got a whole bunch of cities, we can see what happens to them. One of the things we've been doing in the project as well is looking at general population. Don't look at these, they'll mess with your head, but what we've done is basically combined some proxies for climate, which are again on the left-hand side, and some proxies for population, including radiocarbon dates and settlement patterns and that sort of stuff. And we found quite an interesting result from that. So this is just looking on your right-hand side there at the box plots. That's showing how correlated are climate and population trends through time. And what we see is that in the kind of early part of the Holocene, they're quite correlated. And then in the middle Holocene, they get much less correlated. And then in the late part of the Holocene, they should actually be even less correlated, but there's a problem with the radiocarbon dates that means it doesn't work. So what it looks like is that in the second half of the Holocene, around 6,500 BP, contemporary with the earliest urbanism, we get this kind of decoupling of population and climate trends. And that's quite interesting in itself. So I was going to put a picture of a smoking gun at this point, but that looked a bit off when I put it, because it's like a smoking gun, it's kind of violent. So that's something called a smoking gun, which is for like doing cooking of some kind. I don't really understand it, but Heston Blumenthal makes one. Anyway, the point is it's kind of interesting that this decoupling happens at the same time as urbanism. So perhaps urbanism is part of an adaptive strategy to be able to cope with this change in the climate. But that's slightly complicated by the fact that a lot of other things happen at the same time here, right? So you've got things like the state, you've got writing developing around this time, a whole range of different things that are kind of tied up together. So the causal impact of urbanism is a different thing to think about. So the idea we've been playing with a bit, which comes from some conversations we've been having with people like Mike Smith over in Arizona, is this idea of using persistence as a model for sustainability. So Smith's PNAS paper, Smith et al. Write this PNAS paper, and they argue that a sustainable system is one which survives or persists. Now, what that allows us to do is make this link between duration of occupation of a site and sustainability. So how long you're able to hang around for as an urban site, as a city, shows how sustainable you are. Now, we might talk about that a bit, but as an idea, it's kind of interesting to start playing about with. And it also fits with something that archaeology is really good at, right? We're quite good at dating stuff, seeing how long it lasts for, and then watching when it finishes, and understanding that. And in the Middle East, we use pottery for that mainly, and kind of archaeological survey and excavation, that kind of thing. And what it means is if we can take that to be the case, then we can use duration and then compare that to other variables, and that can tell us about the conditions for sustainability. So I'm just going to have a quick run through 3 different ones here that we've been playing about with. Time, so are early cities more sustainable than later ones? Land use, which I'll come on to in a sec, and city size, which hopefully is obvious. So what are the data sets? Well, we've got a big compendium of archaeological sites in Durham that we've been building for a decade or so, of all different sites that we can find from various sources, from surveys, from excavations. So what I've done is taken the sites from Mesopotamia in the northern Levant. We left off the southern Levant because urbanism there is a bit of a different deal. And we took all sites over 10 hectares, and we counted that as urban. So that was our definition, just big, basically. From 10,000 BC to 0 AD. And we left off all of the ones that keep going past 0 AD and keep going to the present day. So that gives us a bit over 600 sites, a bit over 1,200 occupation phases. And for the land use, we compared it to land cover 6K thing that we've been developing. So this is trying to model global land use, and we're developing some ways to do this. I won't go into that here, but if anyone wants to talk to me about land use, I can waffle on for ages about it. But just take that as read for now, and I'll explain it in a bit. So we've got, what I'm going to show you is 3 different slides of results. The first one is just time, basically. So you're going from, on this side you're at like 9000 BC, and on that side you're at 0 AD. And each one of those blocks is just the duration of cities as a box plot. So the mean is the line, and the top and the bottom is the standard deviation, standard box plot way of doing it. So what you can see is basically over time, you get a big drop in how long cities seem to last. So that's the earliest kind of real cities. That's like your Uruks and your Urs and all that kind of thing in the 4th millennium. The ones before that are probably, they're kind of big weird sites, as John Chapman would call them. So your first cities, interestingly, they last a really long time. So that in itself is quite interesting. And then you get this drop over time of how long cities are able to survive for. And it gets really interesting when you think that that's when you get the real kind of large-scale territorial empires, your Neo-Assyrians into your kind of Parthians, classical period, that sort of stuff. And it's also when that decoupling really gets going. So it seems like the decoupling of population and climate also comes with much more churn in urban sites, which is, I haven't really got my head around this at all, but I thought I'd just show you today and see what you thought. Similar kind of thing here, so I'm using land use. Basically, on this side, it's like the really horrible land uses, and on that side, it's the really nice ones. So places where you'd like to live, wouldn't like to live, sorry, and places where you would like to live. And here you get some interesting patterns too. So your marginal areas, they don't have very many sites, but the sites that you do get there last a really long time. They're really persistent. And I think that's probably because in these kinds of landscapes, you can only live in very few places, right? You're living in areas with, karstic sinks, or you're living on an oasis or something nice. So you keep returning there. So that city lasts for a long time, and there's probably a reason it's there that's quite a good reason. On the other side, the optimal areas also last for quite a long time, and there's an interesting kind of, it's quite consistent there in terms of the kind of optimal agriculture, arboriculture. Irrigated landscapes are a little bit less persistent, which is quite interesting, perhaps because you're reliant on quite specific formulations of water management that are able to be kind of messed around with. You get kind of river revulsions and that sort of thing, stops the whole thing working. And then something quite fun in the kind of middle areas, where you have very kind of episodic, like you have periods where you can use that region for specific things. So we have a big one in the early Bronze Age, where they start using the kind of step edges for sheep in a very big way, and then they stop doing it. And it's because of a kind of particular form of environment and political economy and organisation that makes that happen. So these kind of risky areas get exploited, but only not in a very kind of long-term or persistent way. And finally, thinking about site size and persistence, this is a little bit more equivocal. It's a bit of a fuzzy thing going on, but if you, with the eye of faith, you might be able to see that. And there what you can see perhaps is that the main thing we don't get is very many large persistent sites. And it's interesting because there's been a bit of a debate about this. This is the only thing that people have actually talked about persistence very much about. So Roland Fletcher argues that that you don't get large persistent sites, and the larger sites are less persistent. And some other people have actually said it's the other way around, that large sites should be more persistent. So we're hitting the kind of Fletcher side of that argument. We don't seem to have very many huge sites that should have survived for a long time, which, given the size of some of our cities now, is slightly concerning. Right, so what does our data show? Essentially, we should all move to some smaller cities in either very nice or very nasty, but locally nice environments. Ideally, during the late Chalcolithic, but I think that ship's sailed. But the interesting thing is that it seems like thinking with persistence actually has some potential. And there's lots to unpick in the data we've even put through now, but actually we can also lay this against, if we can use duration in this kind of way, then there's lots of other things that we could actually investigate. So some of the things that are concerning people at COP, for example, is the forms of governance that are best for organising this sort of stuff. Do city-states or empires or kind of nation-state-sized polities, do they deal with persistence or allow persistence better or worse? Things like different production and consumption strategies, networks and infrastructure is an interesting one. So someone has done a little bit of work in modern cities looking at kind of positions in trade and exchange networks and how that might lead on to persistence. That's something we could definitely do using archaeological work. And then I'm quite interested in inequality as well. So do more unequal cities do better or worse? And that's, again, something that we're starting to get a handle on in archaeology and an ability to analyse. So I'll finish there. Thanks.
Fantastic. Slightly different scale there. We've all learnt a new word. Any questions? Derek?
I'll ask a question if no one else. Dan, I thought that was great. The latter phase of your the decoupling event sort of thing, where, you know, during the Achaemenid and post-Achaemenid sort of, is there, to what degree do you think that might be about the ability to transfer resources and regional specialisation and production, and as you mentioned, you know, trading systems? Do you think that's potentially a feature or an element of that in what's happening there at the end?
You mean the decoupling?
In that cities become more dependent upon regional networks of trade that might be to some degree dependent upon the imperial infrastructure and transport systems and the sort of organisation of interdependence in production of staples and things like that that might make them more.
Yeah, I think I mean that's got to be part of it, right? But I think we haven't been very good actually at testing that empirically. It's sort of a thing that everyone keeps in their back pocket as an idea, but we could actually model it properly. But I mean, if you actually think about southern Mesopotamia like from really early on, they're moving staples into cities on a massive scale from very early on actually. So like in the terms of the Achaemenid Empire, what they are much better at is transforming much larger areas of their landscapes, right? They put in huge irrigation systems where you didn't have them before, and that just changes the scale of everything. And also, I think I didn't show any of this, and this is quite speculative, but what's coming out of the class project, which is, sorry, the big project I'm running, is it's much more about administration and the capacity to mobilize goods around the place and move them sort of effectively, it seems like, because we've got all this stuff coming out of the plants and animal stuff where they're not changing what they're doing in terms of when a rapid climate change or a long-term climate change thing hits, right? They're using the same animals and there's even the same proportions of animals. What they're better at doing is getting them to the right places at the right moments. But how that all works, I think we need much more kind of almost like institutional economics ideas to come in to help sort that out. That's the next project.
Yes.
So when you were talking at the start about using persistence and duration of these settlements as a kind of proxy for their sustainability performance and how long they last, bringing that into the present day and looking at cities that are lasting a long time. They're lasting a long time. Part of the reason they're not sustainable is because we're consuming more and more and more stuff in order to sustain that persistence of settlement.
Mm-hmm.
So do you consider that the earlier cities which seem to last longer could be lasting longer because they're consuming more, or are they consuming and using resources in a consistent manner throughout that duration, and the later ones are not in some way, or are they using more and more as they continue through their lifetime as a settlement?
Yeah, I think it's sort of it's a difficult thing to think about because actually that's sort of almost a definition of sustainability, is that you're sort of living within your means, as it were, the kind of donut economics world. So by saying that they're lasting a long time, I'm saying they must be doing something along those lines. But the question is how they're doing that. So is it the case that they're using their environment around them in an incredibly efficient way, for example? Or is it that they have really efficient transport networks that allow them to do that kind of thing? So in southern Mesopotamia, that's part of the argument that people have been making for a long time, that because you have this big network of canals, you can mobilize staples all around the place, and so you can have these huge cities that draw on much larger hinterlands. But I think the question for us is like how we get at exactly what's making them sustainable, which is basically how do they maintain themselves. So there's kind of, there was a big sort of, in the late 90s, this kind of urban ecologists started like writing all this cool stuff about this, and then they, for some reason, just sort of stopped writing about it, which is really frustrating. But their ideas are really interesting. They're like, oh, well, if you imagine like your city in a big glass dome, how big does the dome have to be to ensure that that city can operate? And that's sort of what we're getting at here. It's almost going back to like site catchment analysis type stuff. Like, what's the hinterland of these cities, and what do we mean by hinterland? And actually, it'll be different hinterlands for like, you know, the barley that they need versus the water they need versus the lapis lazuli they need. So I think this is almost back to site catchment analysis to try and analyse that.
Right. Fantastic first session. We'll have a 10-minute break now, so if we start again at 5 past. So thank you very much for our 3 speakers so far. That's been brilliant. We'll start again at 5 past.
Oh, no, I did have to. Like, when I'm looking at the differences in this copy, so when you know, when I looked at the time, it was exactly 3,000 BC is exactly when we start dividing the ceramic rock. So you have that issue. It's also been now we know what's the diversity so it can be cheap. What's the definition of the city? And how does it, you know, how do you work with things? But then it's, you know, I think it's kind of so what's it?
Second. I checked it on the only thing is that when you're standing over there and the audience is maybe a little focus.
But can they hear?
Rather than hear sort of administrative, you just
Okay, everyone? Welcome back. So in this next session, we're going to have another talk aligned to one of the SDGs, and then we're going to have a panel discussion with the speakers and also Professor Robin Coningham. So in between the talk and the panel discussion, there'll be a little bit, two or 3 minutes whilst we just get everything set up, because we'll see how it goes with the live stream with YouTube. So just to introduce Professor Becky Gowland, she's going to be talking against the SDG number 3, good health and well-being, but also good news for Becky, she's just been, one of the projects she's involved with, just been shortlisted for the Archaeology Achievement Award. So, well done.
Thanks, Mike. Thanks very much. You're actually getting 2 sustainability goals for the price of 1, because I'm going to be talking about health and well-being, and also I'll be talking about inequalities. And the reason for this is it's kind of impossible, really, to talk about health and well-being without referring to social inequalities. Social class is one of the strongest determinants of health today, and that's because it governs pretty much everything from our living environments, our working environments, our diet, exposure to pollutants. So as the Marmot Review in 2010 told us, health is then a matter of social justice. So the less equal a society, the greater the health disparities between the rich and the poor. And there's also a gradient of ill health from the very richest to the very poorest. And there's lots of figures showing this gradient. So actually we all suffer because of it. Also, as we know, poverty kills. There are also quite stark differences in life expectancy between those living in the most deprived areas and the wealthier areas in this country. Not only will you have a shorter life, but you will live more of your years in living with ill health if you are from one of the more deprived areas. Last year, a new report was published, Marmot 10 years on, and just to reassess where progress was. It's kind of a damning report, really. It starts with the phrase, England is faltering. It's not surprising, really, given the intervening years of austerity. And as the report says, this austerity has cast a long shadow over the lives of children born and growing up under its effects. There was also, around the same time this was published, a UN rapporteur report on child poverty, which was similarly damning for the UK. And this, of course, was before COVID. And then when COVID hit, as we know, it was not a great equaliser. It hit those living in poverty harder than anyone else. And Chris Whitty noted that if you compared a map of COVID mortality with child mortality in the 1850s, it would pretty much map on. And this is partly because both are related to social inequality. In the USA, it's a similar picture. Ibram X. Kendi was asked, why are African Americans more likely to die from COVID? To which he answered, slavery. The reason being that those years of structural violence have not been adequately mitigated within contemporary social structures. So there's a legacy of social injustice that leaves certain members of the population more vulnerable. So in order to understand the present then, to understand contemporary health and well-being, to understand contemporary social inequalities, we have to then look at the past. As those maps show us, there's a long history there that we need to unravel. And that's where we come in. So as a bioarchaeologist, I'm obviously interested in health in the past, and I look at this through the analysis of skeletal remains. So the human skeleton during life is a dynamic living tissue and can tell us all kinds of things about how people lived in the past. And so that's the source of evidence that we use. Just to show you a figure from a recent pilot study with Ellen Kendall and Professor Richard Cookson and Tim Durham from the Equity and Health Policy Centre in York. What they're interested in is the origins of health inequalities. There's this idea that they only sprung up since the sort of 19th century. And we wanted to push that further back in time. What was the relationship between social status, social class, and health in the past? Are we seeing similar gradients and similar inequalities? So we started off just doing a pilot study, quite a crude study looking at differences between poor and affluent, and as far as you can measure those, using generalised skeletal indicators of health stress. And we saw wider inequality within the Romano-British period, which we would have expected anyway because of the social hierarchies at that time. That reduced in the early medieval period, after the collapse of the Roman period, and then gradually increased, becoming widest during the post-medieval period. Obviously, there's a lot of nuance here that needs to be looked into, so we're building on this to try and look at social inequalities over the last 2 millennia, and that's a project we hope to continue going forward. So with this kind of data, we can look at broad population health, but actually, one of the things that's fantastic about the skeleton is that it has biographical power. So we can look at the teeth that are forming at different ages, we can look at bones that are remodelling over different lengths of time, and we can use this to build up a biography of an individual's life. So with this 6-year-old child here, we can sample the tooth of this child in adulthood, because this is a permanent tooth, and that can give us values for diet and stress of that adult when they were from infancy through to early childhood. So we get a life course perspective from the skeleton, and this is one of the things that's really important about it. This is some data from Ellen Kendall, just to kind of illustrate this. So she was doing some incremental sampling of teeth. So each of these lines here represents a kind of chemical biography of an individual. And what she was looking at is these two sites, the nitrogen and carbon from Littleport, which is a site where we think there was malaria, and a very nearby and contemporaneous site down the road. And what you can notice is that the Littleport data is much messier, and the reason that it's messier is because the population is stressed. There's a lot of health stress there, which we think is related to the local disease ecology. But you can use a similar approach to look at biographies of inequality in the past as well, and that's one of the things that we're hoping to develop with the team at York. When you look at a lot of the literature on social inequality today, it very much focuses on children. And there are 2 reasons for this. Firstly, children, as we saw from that earlier map, are a really sensitive barometer of overall population health. If there is stress within a population, you will see it in the children. For us as bioarchaeologists, their remains are therefore particularly useful for understanding past health. The other reason that they're useful is because what happens during childhood will affect that individual during adulthood. So childhood adversity can result in chronic ill health later on in life. There's this idea that children bounce back from illness. They don't. Poorly children make poorly adults. So that's why there's a focus on children today and why they're so useful for us in the past. So just using an example here of really extreme social inequalities, I'm just going to turn briefly to the 19th century. So this was a period when a large proportion of the population were children, were under 20 years of age. It was a period of, as we know, rapid urbanisation and industrialisation, and there was a change in the nature of the work that people were doing. So you get a lot of children working in factories. And there's a quote there from Lord Shaftesbury describing seeing a group of children outside the factory gates, describing them as cadaverous and crooked. And we see glimpses as well in the historical records of the lives of these children. So, for example, Elizabeth Bentley, who worked in a flax mill from the age of 6, a minimum of 14 hours a day, and essentially it crippled her. So by the age of 23, she was in a poorhouse, unable to work. She describes her working life and the dust that got into her lungs, and her skeletal development was impaired such that her joints would dislocate easily. Now, when we look at the skeletal record from this period, it gives us much more information on how widespread these childhood conditions were. In this figure here, the red bars relate to a site in Houston that Mike just mentioned, and pauper apprentices. So these were children who were in workhouses, usually in the south or in the cities. They were taken from the workhouses to work in factories, often in the north of England, far from home, far from any family connections. And when we look at the bones of these children, at least half of them have respiratory problems that are so severe they're actually leaving signs on the bones. So really severe respiratory distress of the kind that Elizabeth mentions. We also see extremely high levels of vitamin D deficiency. So rickets here. This is actually a child of 11. She looks much younger, but you can see these deformities are caused by severe vitamin D. And in the 19th century, the northeast was a focal area for these diseases. I'm also working with a consultant paediatrician at Gateshead Trust, and he is seeing increasing number of cases of vitamin D deficiency in children today, and micronutrient deficiencies, in part because of an increasing reliance on food banks. This is another 19th century site from Leeds, and again, a site associated with extreme poverty. Someone came to visit and talk to the women at the site. How many children do you have? 2. How many have died? 5. And again and again and again. And they comment on just how dirty and insanitary it is, and that the alleyways are so small they don't even know how they get the coffins out. So these are the leg bones. These are both children who are the same age when they died. They were both 9 to 10 years of age, but the one from Leeds is the size of a 3 to 4 year old. When we look at the other bones, you can see this is not how bone is supposed to look. It shouldn't look like shredded wheat. And this is not just poverty that child experienced. When you get things as bad as this is showing us intergenerational poverty. This is back to one of our pauper apprentices. When we look at the teeth from this 12-year-old, you can see that in these milk teeth here, these are the 3 milk teeth, the rest are permanent, lots of lesions on the enamel. That's dental enamel hyperplasia. So we're seeing these on the milk teeth, which are forming in utero, and we're also seeing them on the permanent teeth. So this is not a one-off event. This is systemic. This is long-term deprivation. But the fact that they're on the deciduous teeth is telling us something about the mothers. It's telling us that the mum was in a poor state of health as well, which you might expect given that these are children that were in the workhouse. So this gives us a glimpse of intergenerational poverty and the effects of that. And something that Jonathan Wells has referred to as maternal somatic capital. So the idea being that mums are actually very good at buffering environmental adversity and protecting the developing fetus. But if that mum during her own childhood was deprived, and then her mother in turn, then it leads to what's been referred to as a kind of metabolic ghetto that's difficult to get out of, and limits the ability of the mother to buffer their child from the effects of poverty. And again, this is really important in terms of public health research. So the first 1,000 days of life are known to be particularly important. These are particularly sensitive window of adversity. And so a lot of research has been focused on that. But also we're seeing in the past this evidence of intergenerational health. And that can be difficult to get at in the clinical records. But obviously one of the advantages of archaeology is that long-term view. So why were children treated so poorly? How was this okay? Well, you know, we do have this post-Brexit nostalgia at the moment, it seems, for the 19th century industrial age. But the success of that time was really built on the broken bodies of children like Elizabeth. That's why it was successful, and why England could be competitive in that kind of global market. And the way that they did this, of course, is you remove empathy. If you other people, then you don't really care what happens to them. These children were expendable, and actually no one really cared very much. And that's partly because people were thought to be poor because they were lazy, immoral and feckless, and they were thought to actually be some kind of inferior, subhuman beings. And again, if you other and dehumanize people, it's very easy then to have that cognitive dissonance that you can treat them poorly. There was also this idea between the deserving and the undeserving poor, and quite punitive changes to the poor laws at these times. I've highlighted some of these things in orange because I think there's a lot of resonance with some of the rhetoric that goes on today. So just to conclude then, there has, I feel, been a real tendency to marginalise archaeological studies within public health research. It's thought to be not important or gimmicky, or the evidence is patchy. Well, all evidence is patchy, even the current evidence. But actually, it has a lot of power. So we have this biographical evidence that can give us a life course perspective on health, that can give us insights to the developmental origins of health and disease. It's showing us the impacts of intergenerational poverty and the effects on health inequalities, that cumulative impacts of poverty over time. And also we can look at gradual and catastrophic social and economic changes over time, look at the impact of those on society and how that changes health. So there's a huge amount of potential here, and I guess it's up to us to see that that becomes realised. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Becky. I promise you, for people looking on YouTube, we do cheery topics as well. At this point, has anybody got a quick question for Becky? No? In that case, we will seamlessly bring forward our panel. Becky, would you like to take a seat, all the speakers, and Professor Cunningham as well? And then Alexandra and I will just do a couple of technical things, and then we shall start the panel discussion.
Might want to rotate it a little bit. Or quickly.
That's my technical stuff. To move the out. Okay, so for the final part of our workshop today, what we thought would be really interesting to do would be to have a panel discussion around the role of archaeology in climate change and sustainable development research. So I invited the four speakers to be joined by Rob Witcher, the editor of Antiquity, who have run a number of editorials and special issues looking at aspects of this over the past 5 to 10 years. And also Professor Robin Coningham, the UNESCO chair in our department. So I'm going to leave it up to Rob to kick off.
Okay, thanks, Mike. Well, first of all, I just want to start off by thanking our speakers for their inspiring, fascinating, depressing, but important research that they've communicated in their sort of case studies that feed into these wider sustainable development goals. Archaeology is clearly good for this sort of thing. It can speak to all these different agendas, and we could add in, I think, probably hundreds more case studies and examples to that, whether it's talking about thinking about sustainability of agriculture and different types of crops that are more drought tolerant or heat tolerant, or thinking about ecological baselines to help us better understand sort of looking after different species and extinction. So I think we really, as a discipline, can factor into lots of these sustainability development goals, or sustainable development goals. I wondered though whether to start off, I'd provoke our speakers and our respondent as well, Robin Coningham, by sort of taking inspiration from a paper I heard earlier this week by Professor Felix Reed, who was also talking about climate change in the week of COP26, when he said it's no longer about the figures, it's not about the science anymore, it's about persuasion, it's about the politics. In other words, we've got the case studies, we know what we've got the health, we know about the inequalities of health and so on, we know about the cultural destruction of people's identities and memories and so on, and the unsustainability maybe of cities, the awful effects of sort of rain in the Arctic. How do we, as well as adding more case studies to that, how do we mobilise that information in a way that's effective, that brings about action? What do we, in other words, we know what we're good at, what do we need to get better at if we're going to do something tangible and real to help bring about these sustainable goals? So I'm provoking you with that thought, because I don't know if anybody wants to take the bait.
I'll just say one thing, if that's okay. I'll take my mask off while I speak. I won't breathe on you. I think people have to care, and I think that's the problem. People getting on with their day-to-day lives and not necessarily seeing the actual effects on them. We're not, obviously lots of people are. And I think people have to care, and I think it goes back maybe also to the empathy as well. So people have to care about all of these reindeer dying and people's livelihoods disappearing, and they need to care about these archaeological sites. So I think it's creating those connections and empathy, and maybe through life stories or case studies. I know for my line of work, when we're trying to get people to connect with an issue or connect with the past, we create these life stories, these osteobiographies, and that can be a powerful means. And I wonder if we need to do something like that. So,
yeah, absolutely. How do we connect with people?
Yeah, I really enjoyed it in terms of aligning big world pictures with archaeology, and I suppose part of our challenge as archaeologists is we aren't anywhere near the top tables. We can evoke engagement in the stories, and archaeologists have been magnificent storytellers. You know, if you think over the last 200 years, we have explained the collapse of civilizations and cities through invasions, through climate change, through multivariant features. So, in a way, we have a very powerful voice, but the audience that we need to connect with and communicate with is maybe not quite so tuned to what we are saying. Part of that is because for us, the SDGs are not necessarily integrated into our grants. Those of you who've had to complete for a grant an ODA statement of how your research will actually benefit individuals socially and economically. When you sit down and you have to try and frame that and then identify how you will gather the evidence to demonstrate that, that is somewhere where I think most of us are not yet there. So we can mount case studies, very persuasive case studies, but the challenge is we need to move beyond case studies, and we need to move into solutions, translating into solutions and actions. And I think as a whole, as a discipline, we're not really there yet. We are starting conversations now as a discipline. The AAA in America had a climate task force maybe 4 years ago established. They've already produced their reports. In the UK, we're in this very odd position where we are a global intellectual leader, but actually, where's the voice? Is it the fellows at the British Academy? Is it the peer review board of AHRC? Is it Antiquity? Is it the CBA? You know, the question is, where are those discussions being made? And also, is it really an audience that will listen? Because yes, we need to engage, but also we need to be able to have the language to talk to policy makers and politicians and funding bodies. And for that, we need to understand
SDGs, we need to understand and recognise archaeology isn't in the SDGs, cultural heritage is, so the way we frame our approach, and also we need to be used to, dare I say, value for money discussions, because in a way that's partly where we can successfully translate case studies into lessons learned, into then actions and solutions. So in a way, it's the next steps from here which are the most demanding, the newest and the challenging, in my opinion.
and those new, in a sense, those next steps demand new skills or significantly enhancing those skills that we have now in terms of that translation of our research and communicate what we maybe used to call knowledge transfer, but speaking to those policymakers in a language that they understand and can then sort of move up to the decision makers that influence.
And sitting in those multidisciplinary groups to remind them what as a discipline we can offer. I sat in a group and for 2 hours talking about climate change, cities, resilience, sustainability, and we sat there and it was fascinating and there was not a squeak about archaeology. And at the end, there was this sort of outpouring of what archaeology can offer because of that longitudinal evidential platform, which actually we're pretty good at casting. So once that is mobilized, then we can start to draw those lessons into the solutions.
Yeah, go on.
I was just going to say, it's also worth distinguishing between the different groups we want to talk to, right? So you're talking more about policymakers and decision makers, as it were, but there's also the public. And historically, archaeology's not been very good at talking to policymakers, but it's been a lot better at talking to the public because we have, buildings like museums where we can go and do that sort of thing. And there's a sort of almost tactical question, actually, about whether the best thing to do is, and probably we should do both, obviously, but the problem is either, it's not the case actually that policymakers don't know what to do. They do know what to do. There are just structural conditions around late capitalism and democracy that stop them doing it to some degree, right? So what's going to change that is actually potentially a kind of upswelling of democracy, of people who change their minds in the public. And that's where we might be able to have more of an impact, right? Like if we can get every museum having every single thing is about climate change repeatedly, what would that actually do? And is that maybe easier than getting into a room with policy makers and convincing them of something which in their heart of hearts they already know, right?
Yeah, I think, as you say, that maybe not either or, so we need to be moving, if we're going to communicate with.
But I definitely agree with Robin that we've been pretty rubbish at getting in those rooms as well, actually. There's a really good, do you know that Tim Collar paper about the IPCC and how archaeologists should engage with it in American antiquity? That's really worth a read about what we've done wrong and what we could do, actually. And it's quite simple changes to the way we do things.
Yeah, I think it's certainly true that we've, I've seen multiple papers saying the same thing as, the role of archaeology in recognising cultural heritage in IPCC reports. It didn't come through until, 2014, something like that, and why does archaeology not have this voice? Why hasn't it been recognised? And that's partly us, I guess. We need to publish in the right journals that are read by the right people. But also it's, I don't know, what else is it that we have to do to communicate with the public as well?
We have to write the policy statements. And I think we're just not doing that. So as part of the Humanor project, this project on the reindeer herders, my colleague David Anderson did produce a policy statement that was sent to the local government who's dealing with reindeer herders in the Yamal, on the Yamal Peninsula. But I think we don't do that often enough. And so I think perhaps we should just have a look at our own project when we're putting together our project, our impact statements, and actually think about how we can put together policy statements and which government body or working group we're going to submit them to, and actually target them accordingly. Yeah, I don't think we do that enough. I certainly didn't until I became involved with that project, and it really shifted my thinking about the importance of doing that.
important who we're working with. So for instance, with ourselves working with actually legal experts in translating our work in cultural heritage into something that actually means something to international criminal courts, or to, you know, and bringing that together. And I don't think we always take that next step to sort of work with those groups in the same way that we can develop policy statements, or we can do that.
Yeah, I mean, one thing that strikes me is that there's a big to-do list here, isn't it? And in a sense, perhaps we need to think more strategically as a discipline, or as a group of disciplines, even more importantly, about how we strategically do these things, because there's no point each of us individually sitting down thinking, I need to extend my alliances with lawyers and with climate scientists and with the public in museums and with people working in local health. Perhaps we need to think more strategically about what are the skills that we need to develop, both for ourselves and training for our students, but also then thinking about maybe how we, the other end, our funding bodies, is the structure of funding set up in a way that is helping us or hindering us to do this kind of research?
Just quickly, I was going to say, I think you're right, so you should wait for this comment. But I do think you're absolutely right, that there's no, in archaeology we don't have a very good point of the pyramid at the very top of who speaks to the discipline and makes stuff happen, because we have, the commercial world on museums and academic, it's all quite fragmented. You don't have the Royal Geographic Society or something in quite the same way. It's like the voice of the discipline, and that's a problem for us, because it means you can't make these coordinations very easily. And I agree, like policy documents and all that stuff is great, but it's quite a specific language and a specific way of doing things, and you need to resource it properly as a discipline to be able to do it, I think. And there's not a clear way where that could happen from the relatively low base that archaeology is starting from. I think that's the problem.
And I mean, it's fascinating, because I was involved in a scoping project this year for the British Council, and it was working with management consultants doing a scoping of a What Works centre, which we have for education, for policing, but this was for cultural heritage protection. Now, part of that was doing this online survey interviews, and we were asking people, practitioners, academics, from the Levant, from South Asia, from East Africa, and also the UK, so it was focused in those areas. Only about 45% of respondents actually utilised SDGs in any of their work to log whether what they did had any relevance to SDGs. Also, only 18% identified climate change as the biggest threat to the heritage sites they were engaged with. So, whilst we should be aware climate emergency and there is a role to play, we also should be aware that actually there are other threats to the protection, the preservation of cultural heritage, and that actually we need to take all of those on board, rather than in a way following the wagon and jumping on the biggest voice at the moment. Yes, we have to engage. Yes, and it's an emergency. But also we should be aware that for many of our fellow practitioners around the world, the threats are even greater more immediate from certain areas. And so, whether we engage with SDGs fully within our teaching, so take this module, one of the learning outcomes will be SDG 11.4. And the cynic might say the Times Higher now publishes a league table for SDG impact. And interestingly, when I was looking through at Durham's count on it, we did very well for SDG 11. We didn't do a return for climate action, which is an interesting position. But it's there, it's not going away. It will actually affect our overall league tables. So for universities to reckon that SDGs are not just part of ODA work, part of international aid, it also, as has been made absolutely clear, these are things that have to start at home here here as well.
Yeah, I think one of the other questions I was going to ask was the degree to which we think we should be, the research that we do and the impact, the outreach that we have should be driven by SDGs, or whether they are, they're both very broad in some respects and all-encompassing, but they're also potentially quite specific, and you know, they're not legally binding. They're kind of goals very much, rather than sort of hard commitments. And you know, some of us might see that some of those as rather more urgent and, you know, need addressing before 2030 rather than later.
But it also depends on the organisation. Some of the organisations I work with, like UNESCO, all their reporting is in terms of SDG blocks. When we do reports on our activities, it's reporting in SDG blocks. So in a way, it's how you are domesticated to the world of the institution. So we could start by doing a wonderful survey here. Who believes that your modules, when you choose them, should have links to SDGs, or should we have standalone, integrated or standalone? So standalone, if you raise your hand. Yeah, one. Integrated. And it's not for us. Right? That's positive.
You'll be pleased to know, Robin, that the SDGs were referenced in the new documents for the forensic masters.
Oh, excellent. But I think that the integration of those within our teaching and more broadly how we're going to address these wider issues, you know, rather than just focusing on the goals, you know, the actual, the bigger picture, how we're going to communicate more effectively and how we're going to translate the significance of what we do more generally. That's, if we can't teach that, you know, then we're not going to be making that change.
I think also that I always use this Chris Gosling quote that landscape archaeology is a usefully ambiguous concept, and they're usefully ambiguous, aren't they? Like, I don't think we wouldn't have to change our teaching dramatically to actually align with pretty much everything we do with them. It just would, it's more about the alignment and then the outcomes of it, and thinking in that sort of outcome way. So it's probably worth doing, especially if it does just directly link us into all the policy stuff. And
yeah, absolutely. Does anybody want to pick up on any of those points on our panel? I saw a hand wave at the back, which I should come to if not. Yeah. And Derek?
Can I ask a question? From what you said, especially at the beginning about communicating our ideas, I mean, I wonder, are we jumping the gun a little bit? Because it's certainly in relation to climate change. I mean, on the one hand, we're scientists or academics researching, on the other hand, we're lobbyists and making political points. How clear is that story of climate change? You know, there are many case studies, but how many of them are unambiguous? I mean, I remember reading Dan's book just recently, which, to some degree, at least challenges the role of climate on the development of cities in Mesopotamia. It's very difficult to find a case study which is unambiguous, isn't it, on the role of climate change and its effect on human societies. So where do we position ourselves? Are we still trying to figure out what's going on, or have we got a clear idea of what's going on, and we now want to communicate it to the decision makers?
Dan, do you want to respond to that one?
yeah, I mean, I agree. I disagree with Felix about the importance of the science being settled and over. I don't think it is at all. And there's much more. It's also been sort of subject to. There's some quite interesting kind of sociology of science to be written here, right? About, like, you know, climate change becoming an issue, and then loads of people writing lots of big books and articles about collapse and getting very scared about it. And then there's a sort of backlash now where people are like, maybe not, guys. Like, maybe there's something more interesting to be learned about. Because also, if you have just a great big blanket collapse, that's also not very interesting for the IPCC, because you're like, well, it's the end of days, goodbye. So I do think there's a lot more science to be done, for sure. I mean, the interesting thing about the IPCC is that they have these really great ways of dealing with that uncertainty, basically. And as disciplines or as sub-disciplines, you come to a particular kinds of agreement, and then you basically give it various ways of weightings of certainty in terms of how sure you are that this is the case. And it's easier in highly quantifiable, climate science or something where you get, outputs that give you a level of uncertainty, like a standard deviation or something. But there's ways of doing that in archaeology too, where you give that kind of quantifiable uncertainty, and then you've kind of helped, right? You've put the disciplinary position in the pot, kind of thing, that then the decision makers can make decisions about. So I think I agree. We need to keep doing the science, and we need to try to come to some agreements. But also, saying we're not quite sure is not the end of the world, because it's sort of better than just no data at all, right? Like that's the sort of IPCC model. So I hope that answers this question.
Yeah.
I was kind of struck by what Becky was saying about the marginalisation of some of the archaeological data in the health studies, because as you've demonstrated, it's relevant and then can.
Well, I think certainly within the health context, I've attempted to talk to people who are working on the state, and we very much marginalised. We're almost like a novelty act. So the Lancet might publish a Christmas paper that involves bones because it's always this fun. So we are very much sort of marginalised, and that makes us feel insecure. We feel insecure about our data because we can't match it up to clinical data. But actually, there is no other way of knowing this stuff. It's only the archaeological evidence is telling us about inequality 2,000 years ago that is giving us that long view. So yes, our evidence is ambiguous, it's patchy, it's not what we would want, but it's all there is, and it's all they've got as well. Yeah. And their evidence doesn't bear too much scrutiny either, quite often. So I think it's that. I think we need to have confidence in what we do as well. And we need to express that. I do feel personally that I need, when I'm working in this area, I've worked to get some allies who are taken seriously and have that experience of public health, and aligning myself to them as a way of getting that foot in the door. But yes, we need to be able to do that independently as well.
Great. Robin?
I think what Becky's just said, and partly reflecting on Derek's question, it also comes to us as specialists in particular areas, what we actually speak on and what we put forward as those examples, case studies, learning. So, for example, our work with the post-disaster environment in the Kathmandu Valley after the 2015 Gurkha earthquake, some of the elements that have come out of that have actually been used by engineers, by policymakers, because we are learning about indigenous knowledge, local indigenous technology, and its resilience to earthquakes. Now, what is interesting is that according to ISO, you have a very well-known loading capacity for the elements in this building. Okay, it's an international standard. A brick will have an international standard for its strength. You take a piece of, say, salwood from the southern Terai, which weighs 1.5 tons and which is 5 meters long, there is no such standard. Therefore, when you're tendering, everything is actually weighed towards what you have an international standard for, when indigenous knowledge knows you can build a building. Now with the archaeology we know, that building will stand for 1,000 years. Show me a piece of concrete built architecture that will last that long, 100 years, and be resilient to those sorts of forces. We also know from, for example, the copper sort of shoes on them, the copper which begins to oxidize, that's purposeful, because that actually retards mold and also actually retards termites. So actually you have elements from design, some of which have been forgotten by local artisans, but actually are critical. So it's what you are putting forward as your element to those discussions. And that helps you then build to the debate about vernacular artisans who after a disaster tend to be just pushed to one side as all the people with their PhDs, their professorships, their doctorates, their masters, with recognisable sort of academic qualifications in that sort of hierarchy, push in because they are the experts. And those with indigenous knowledge actually are pushed to sidelines. So partly we have this ability to actually look in the past for case studies which can help and begin to bring, for example, accessibility, inclusion, engagement, and lessening of that inequality that actually by default international standards and recognised academic standards begin to suppress. So I think in answer, we cannot claim to offer an answer for every single element within the SDGs, but there are some areas where actually when we speak we can do with authority, with evidence, and actually have an impact far beyond probably one would anticipate initially as someone who digs a hole.
Yeah, and I think that partly talks to what Dan was saying about the completed experiments, isn't it? We have those examples of previous cycles of urbanism or types of traditional knowledge that have been lost and can be revived. And I suppose it also talks to the idea of, it's in some respects the sustainability goals are quite top down, whereas actually, as we've seen with COVID, sometimes what we need as solutions are bottom up. It's not just a case of bursting in and sort of with the right answer. It's a case of co-producing the answer or listening and working out how to do that collaboratively. Good, I read that. I see Mike is.
I'm sorry to be approaching, but I have some strict COVID regulations I have to stick to. So, a fascinating 2 hours, I hope you agree. I think everyone has contributed some really fantastic, thought-provoking, and frankly, scary viewpoints about how archaeology should be part of the discussions that are going on, and we will be in the future. This is a beginning of a conversation in this department, and we will continue with it. I say that as Director of Research. I'm sure as Director of Education, Karen will back me up, and we have the absolute backing of the Head of Department and DMG. So all I've got left to do is thank everybody, all the speakers, for a fantastic set of evidence, and thank you everyone for coming. So, and also, of course, everyone on YouTube, thank you for joining as well. So thank you everyone, well done.
Yes, exactly. I was thinking you pushed that.